Today, Melbourne to go back into lockdown at midnight as Victoria records another triple-figure rise in cases.
As painful and frustrating and difficult as that will be, we will be able to get to the other side.
Also ahead, passengers let off a Melbourne to Sydney Jetstar flight without screening in breach of coronavirus protocols. New South Wales residents on the southern border urged not to travel after a Victorian teenager holidaying on the south coast tests positive for COVID-19. And Australian Winter Olympian Alex Pullin drowns in a spearfishing accident on the Gold Coast. More on all those stories in just a moment, but first I want to bring you some breaking news. Police have arrested a 14-year-old girl this afternoon after the death of a 10-year-old girl in northwest New South Wales earlier on this morning. Emergency services were called to a property at Gundar at about 7:45 this morning, following reports that the 10-year-old girl had been seriously injured. Police have confirmed that she died at the scene. Officers then arrested a 14-year-old. She is being held at the local police station. That is all the details we have at the moment. We'll bring you more on this as soon as we can. Now, the clock is ticking towards Melbourne's second lockdown of the coronavirus pandemic as the Victorian Premier announces 134 new cases in the state overnight. The Prime Minister says it's a challenging time and heartbreaking for those going back into lockdown. For more, we're joined by National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett. Hi there, Greg. What was the Prime Minister's message today about what is happening across Victoria and indeed around Australia?
Well, Scott Morrison hasn't actually said that much publicly in the last 72 hours or so, Lorna, since the Victorian situation with COVID-19 began to unravel spectacularly with those ever-increasing numbers of cases. They did drop off slightly today. So this, more than anything else, Lorna, was Scott Morrison's opportunity to empathise with Victorians and also to explain why he supports these localised controls around the borders of Victoria and the lockdowns around the greater city of Melbourne too, because it's somewhat contradictory. No one cheered more than the Prime Minister, you might recall, Lorna, at the reopening of economies and the removal of border restrictions. So he wanted to explain that while that was true, he's all for reopening, it was never counter to that plan that a state couldn't go ahead and do, as Premier Daniel Andrews is now doing in Victoria, and as Gladys Berejiklian is supporting him from New South Wales as well. One other point was made on the way through. A lot of these local pressures around the country have stemmed from returned flights from overseas and lapsed quarantine arrangements in hotels. Now, Scott Morrison's been under some pressure from the premiers to put some caps on the number of flights coming into Australia. Predominantly, we're talking returning Australians here. He flags that that will happen, and he'll have more to say about that at National Cabinet on Friday. But above all else, this really was about empathising with the people of Victoria.
In Melbourne now, of course, there's always the risk it could happen in other cities, and every step is being taken to seek to prevent that wherever possible. But we're all Melburnians now when it comes to the challenges we face. We're all Victorians now, because we're all Australians, and that's where the challenge is right now.
So National Cabinet Friday, we'll hear more about those restrictions on arrivals, but the Cabinet is meeting today. What's on the agenda, Greg?
Yes, pretty much as we speak, I think, Lorna, they should be locked away down the back of this building here in Parliament House. A few things on the agenda. One is to keep working through this large body of work, which we won't learn very much about until the 23rd of this month, and that is the question of what happens to financial support payments that the Commonwealth's been doing to the tune of more than $100 billion, 250 if you roll all Commonwealth measures packages together, but principally we're talking about the job seeker and the job keeper payments. They'll expire at the end of September. Some form of support will be needed beyond that, and that's something that Cabinet is spending many hours on. But one other matter here, Lorna, and that is the situation in Hong Kong. A matter of record that Australia is very much in strain and time of tension with Beijing. Something's about to happen here which will not support that at all, won't aid the events of recent weeks and months with Beijing. That is that Cabinet's considering a package of visa arrangements now that Beijing has had its way with the territory and imposed these national security laws. It's determined that life will not be good and will not go back to normal for protesters in Hong Kong, the former British colony and now Chinese territory. So they're putting the finishing touches to something that will enable them to get a classification of visa and then come and call Australia home. Now, there's widespread support for this Hong Kong package. It comes from both sides of politics, none more so than the co-conveners on Labor and the Liberal side of a parliamentary friendship group for Hong Kong. On the Liberal side, it's led by Kevin Andrews. He's the member for Menzies down in Melbourne. We're going to be able to hear his thoughts in full on this matter a little later, but Kevin Andrews has explained to us, Lorna, that he feels there is ample scope to particularly target young Hong Kongers with this visa migration package.
What I think we should do is to provide a visa for young Hong Kong people. The British government has announced that holders of the British nationals' overseas passport will be able to return to the UK. That's immediately up to about 300,000 people and potentially millions of people. But the missing group is the young people, and they're the ones that have been at the forefront of these protests in Hong Kong. We could provide visas for students to come to Australian universities, which after all are looking for overseas students at the present time, and that could give them ultimately a way to get permanent residency of Australia.
OK, so Kevin Andrews there. We did speak to him at some length, Lorna, and we'll be able to bring that to people later this hour. Of course, no afternoon briefing with Patricia Karvelis at the moment, but we'll try and fill the breach with some exploration there with Kevin Andrews of the situation in Hong Kong and the answer that Australia should come back with.
Greg, we look forward to that. We're going to have that in about 25 minutes' time here on the News Channel. Thanks, Greg. Now, Victoria has recorded 134 new infections of coronavirus, taking the state's tally to 2,942. It comes ahead of Stage 3 restrictions being reimposed for metropolitan Melbourne and the Mitchell Shire from midnight tonight. Premier Daniel Andrews says the number of people infected in the city's locked-down public housing towers has now risen to 75.
I can confirm that 11 of those 134 cases are connected to contained outbreaks, and 123 of those are under investigation by our public health team. 75 cases now in the 9 towers that are locked down. In terms of some of those being a reconciliation where they would have been known positives in our numbers but have only now been able to be attributed to residency in the towers, but the total number is 75. And the Chief Health Officer will be able to speak to that or at least provide further information at a later point. We have 860 active cases, 41 Victorians are in hospital and 7 of those are receiving intensive care. The story of the day, though, from a public health and activity point of view, is the fact that we did 29,424 tests yesterday, so substantially higher than the records we had set earlier in the week. That takes us to a total of 1,008,677 tests since January 1. So as we predicted, we've broken through that 1 million test barrier, given the almost 30,000 tests that were conducted yesterday. Can I again thank every single Victorian who's come forward for a test, and the many thousands of people who are working to take those tests and to process them.
Daniel Andrews speaking earlier. Well, the economy's been a consistent concern as political leaders and health authorities try to navigate the COVID-19 crisis, and it's uncertain what the impact of further lockdowns there in Victoria will be. For more, our business editor Ian Verinder joins us now live. Hi there, Ian. I mean, some of these businesses in Melbourne, in the surrounding areas, already saying that they won't be able to survive this next 6-week period. Is there any way of assessing how the economy will cope with this new lockdown?
Well, Lorna, clearly this is a major setback, not just for Melbourne and Victoria, but for the nation, and particularly in terms of our economic recovery. And it's 6 weeks as a lockdown, which is a very extended period. So this will flow through to the rest of the country. I mean, Victoria accounts for about 20% of the national population, but in 2019, before this pandemic hit, it accounted for about 40% of our GDP growth. So you're stripping that kind of growth out of previous growth out of an already quite damaged economy, and this is going to hurt nationally.
Ian, at this stage, what are the predictions for how bad the impact of the pandemic will be for Australia? Is it possible to say?
Most of these things are measured in terms of GDP and growth and so forth, but the real pain that is exerted through the economy through these kind of downturns is in unemployment. And what we're seeing at the moment, we've got an official unemployment rate of about 7.1%. But no economists really believe that that is the case. You know, you've got a lot of people who aren't looking for work at the moment because there's no jobs. So they're considered to be not part of the workforce anymore. So that artificially lowers the unemployment rate. We've got a lot of people on JobKeeper payments, which again strips out a lot of people off the unemployment numbers. I think most economists would think that our unemployment rate at the moment would be up around 12, maybe even 14%. Possibly even higher. And if you look at youth, that is where the pain is really concentrated. And you've got kids who have left school or just left university this year who simply can't get a job and are going to struggle into the future.
Yeah, lots of questions, haven't there been, for the Treasurer and the Prime Minister about whether income support will be continued past September. A couple of other things to talk to you about. Banks extending their grace period for loan repayments.
Yeah, well, this, Lorna, you've just mentioned the government extending its rescue packages and support packages. The banks today were also going to cut off their support in September 30. So all of these things were going to come to a head pretty much within 1 week. Now, the banks today have decided to extend for another 4 months. So that would make a 10-month grace period on anybody who is having trouble repaying their loans. And we're talking about households and business here. About 10% of all mortgages and about 15% of all business loans currently are on this support where they don't have to meet their repayments. Bear in mind, that's not as if they're forgiven completely. Anything that they don't pay now is being recapitalised into their loans, and they will have to pay it off eventually. I guess the difficulty is how many people will fail, how many people will not be able to find a job, how many businesses will go out the back door as a result of this. And that will then reverberate through to the banks, who will ratchet up higher losses next year as a result of this. So they're kind of extending the pain in a way.
Yeah, still trouble further down the line. One final thing, what's this I'm hearing about bringing forward tax cuts, income tax cuts?
Yeah, well, you might recall in the last few budgets that the government has delivered, there's been tax cuts have been on the table, and one thing the Treasurer indicated today was that he might try and bring some of those tax cuts forward as a way of, well, firstly, I guess, putting more money into people's pockets to spur on a bit of spending, and also to ease the pain of this crisis that we're in at the moment. But the downside to that is it would make it much more difficult for the government to achieve a balanced budget because they'll be getting less money in the door.
All right, Ian, thank you very much for that. Ian Verinder there. The ABC has obtained a leak email which reveals New South Wales Health failed to screen passengers on board a Melbourne to Sydney flight last night. Reporter Mark Reddy has more.
So this email was sent out by Sydney Airport warning Jetstar and Virgin about the fact that media were at the airport last night, and there was one flight which came in with around 50 passengers, and they all didn't go through the screening process by New South Wales Health and New South Wales Police. This was JQ 520. It landed at around 6:45 last night. Now, what we know is that all these passengers went through the airport and straight to their destinations without any sort of checks. We know that this happened just 2 hours or a few hours before the border closed. And we also know, though, that yesterday travellers were told that they couldn't go to New South Wales if they didn't have a exceptional circumstance. So it could be for urgent medical care, it could be for legal obligations, but it also could be returning residents. Now, because no ID checks and temperature checks took place, all these passengers were just allowed to simply wander off into the terminal, and now they are all being instructed to isolate for 14 days at least, but also if they are showing symptoms to get checked.
Have we heard from Jetstar or New South Wales Health on this?
Well, at this stage, we know that Jetstar has only released a statement. It took them about 6 hours to respond to our request. Basically, they say that they've provided all the passenger details to the health department so they can chase up these passengers. They also say that they reviewed their procedures that are taking place at the airports because there were a number of flights that arrived around the same time. And what we also know is that Victorian Health conducted temperature checks and also checked those hotspot postcodes to see if any passengers were from there before the departure. So there were some checks. However, simply we know that this was rushed through in Victoria because when New South Wales announced the change in orders, it was 12:01 a.m. and then at 3 p.m. the Victorian government made that clear in a press conference by Daniel Andrews. So that didn't really give much time for people getting on flights at, say, 4 or 5 p.m.
What should happen as a flight arrives from Melbourne into Sydney with these new protocols in place?
Yeah, so what really should happen is passengers are socially distant, wearing masks, and one by one they come off the plane. They show their details, their postcodes, where they've been, do they have any symptoms, but they also have to say, why they're here. And we did hear, though, from the Chief Medical Officer, Kerry Chant, this morning. She touched on this issue very lightly.
So there was an issue at the airport where passengers were disembarked when the health screening team were screening another airline. The airport have now put in protocols to ensure that the health teams are there and are able to do the screening, and no one's allowed to disembark before that happens. All of those individuals are known. Obviously, you get tickets when you're on a plane. We are in the process of chasing them up. If anyone's been travelled in breach of any orders, we'll refer them to police and take the appropriate action depending on whether anyone is symptomatic to ensure that the community is protected.
That's interesting. So are they relying on people seeing the news and saying, oh, I was on that flight, I better stay at home or in my hotel for 2 weeks? Or are they actually proactively seeking these people? Yeah, well, I mean, it's hoped that now the message is out there that these people will either contact New South Wales Health or at least contact the airlines so this message can be passed on. But it really does come down to the responsibility of people. They need to isolate for 14 days if they were on those flights last night, and that remains staying inside. Mark Reddy there. The case involving a teenager from Victoria testing positive to the virus has prompted the Premier of New South Wales to consider further restrictions on residents living on its southern border. And Gladys Berejiklian has asked residents in that region not to travel to other parts of the state. Reporter Jessie Dorset has more from Albury.
Traffic's flowing a lot faster this afternoon. We can see that police are waiting for drivers to come here. They're checking their details, their permits. Most of these people are locals that live in Albury, Wodonga, and they're crossing the New South Wales-Victorian border to go to work or perhaps medical appointments. It was a lot busier this afternoon. At this very checkpoint, there were 3,000 cars in about 3 hours' time. So a very busy time then. This is certainly one of the bigger checkpoints. There are 54 others on the New South Wales-Victorian border. Big operation, so 650 police officers and 300 troops have been brought to southern New South Wales to make it work. on the whole, most people have been pretty understanding despite some teething issues.
It's nearly 9:40.
What time did you leave?
7:40 in West Wodonga.
How was the wait?
It was long and painful.
For about an hour and a half. Yeah.
Was it a frustrating process?
Nah, it's fine. It's what's got to happen. So I'm not too worried about it. It's annoying, but it is what it is. Can't really do much about it.
Are you late for work yet?
Yeah, boss knows though, so it's fine.
I've been on the road about 3 hours. I left my home at 7 o'clock, but still going to work.
I left work at Wodonga Hospital at 7:30. Still going.
Has it been frustrating?
I just turned the radio up. I've got sultanas, I'm right.
Got a medical appointment, it was at 9 o'clock. Yep.
So how late are you?
About 45 minutes. Yep. Yeah.
And Lorna, I just want to bring you some breaking news that we've just gotten in the past couple of minutes regarding this operation. A man has been arrested, allegedly attempting to cross from Victoria to New South Wales. That happened at Cowra, which is west of where we are here at Albury. Police have arrested that man. They've brought him to the police station here in Albury. They say they're assisting him with their inquiries. His wife and 3 children returned to Victoria on the police's orders.
Interesting. Well, Jessie, the Premier did warn people in border communities not to travel to other parts of New South Wales, didn't she? Because of this confirmed case on the New South Wales south coast.
Yeah, well, we can see how many people are crossing into New South Wales just at this checkpoint alone. And so authorities here in New South Wales are really worried about the virus spreading from Victoria. They're desperate to avoid the worsening crisis in Melbourne. So today, Gladys Berejiklian, the New South Wales Premier, has asked people in border communities like Albury not to travel to other parts of New South Wales, and vice versa. She doesn't want people from other parts of the state coming here. Ms Berejiklian says the government is considering formal restrictions. We should hear more about that over the coming days. And Gladys Berejiklian says people returning from Victoria to New South Wales could face 2 weeks forced quarantine in hotels in the future, similar to the system that international arrivals currently face. The difference being the Victorians or returning New South Wales residents may have to pay for their stay in quarantine if that goes ahead.
There's a lot of nervousness, isn't there, Jessie? And tell us about this case, this teenager who initially tested negative.
Yeah, a Victorian teenager who's not from one of the hotspots in Melbourne. He was told by Victorian authorities that he didn't have coronavirus after he was tested. So he and his family came to southern New South Wales, the South Coast region, for a holiday. But then they were informed that the boy did have coronavirus. He was in fact positive. Now in that time the boy had visited the Tathra pub at Tathra. There were 80 people or so there, and so as a precaution they're now being contacted by the health officials. But the New South Wales Chief Health Officer, Dr Kerry Chance, says the risk that he's passed the virus on to those people is low.
This is a really very critical time for us in the New South Wales response, and I need to find any seeding of the community at the earliest possible time for us to be able to put that containment response around it. It is essential. So, and I just want to thank and appreciate the community. Our testing rates have actually held up pretty high, and it's real credit to the community. And we are doing all we can to make the testing as easy as possible.
And Lorna, of course, the message from Dr Kerry Chant and all of the health officials this afternoon is, if you're worried, even if you have the mildest of symptoms, please get tested for coronavirus.
The Northern Territory will close its borders to Victoria indefinitely. NT Chief Minister Michael Gunner says he now considers the entire state of Victoria a coronavirus hotspot due to the spike in cases. From Friday next week, other people arriving in the NT will no longer need to undergo 2 weeks of self-isolation. But anyone who enters from a coronavirus hotspot will need to pay for their own fortnight of mandatory supervised quarantine.
We hoped Victoria would get better, but it didn't. It got worse. We hoped the numbers would go down, but they have gone up. Because of our 4-week buffer, we are prepared and we can do what is needed to keep the Territory the safest place in Australia. From 17 July, our hard borders for hotspots policy kicks in. From that date, people can come to the Territory as long as they've not been in a hotspot. On Monday, I confirmed that all of Greater Melbourne will be declared a coronavirus hotspot for the purposes of travel to the Territory, and the Chief Health Officer issued that direction yesterday. I also asked Dr Heggie to review the rest of Victoria in light of yesterday's record numbers. Following his review, I am declaring all of Victoria a hotspot for the purposes of travel to the Northern Territory. The Territory's borders will stay closed to all of Victoria until further notice. They are shut indefinitely. There are three key reasons. First, the escalating cases in Melbourne. Second, the extending community transmission. And third, the unacceptable risk of spread to regional areas. Yesterday's 191 cases in Victoria was the highest daily number since this crisis began. More than 150 of those cases are still under investigation, which means the source of the infection is yet to be explained. They don't know where it is coming from. Although the outbreaks are in certain suburbs of Melbourne, they are spread across the metropolitan area, making them more difficult to contain. And there are only 2 local government areas in Melbourne that don't currently have an active case.
To America now, and the President Donald Trump says he thinks the United States is in a good place, despite the country recording more than 60,000 new daily coronavirus cases. It is another record and brings the total number of confirmed cases to just under 3 million. More than 131,000 people have died. The US leading infectious diseases expert, Anthony Fauci, yesterday warned the country was still knee-deep in the pandemic's first wave. But President Trump says he disagrees with that assessment.
We watch very closely, and we've done it right. When you look at what happened with Sweden, I kept hearing about Sweden with the herd, with the pure herd. The herd concept of opening up and keeping open, all of a sudden it exploded. You look at what's going on in Brazil and a couple of other places. So we've really done it right, but now it's time to be open. It's time to stay open, and we will put out the fires as they come up.
Well, Brazil's president, who has been criticised for his cavalier approach to the country's coronavirus outbreak, is the latest world leader to contract it. But even as Jair Bolsonaro announced his infection, he dismissed the dangers, despite the virus killing more than 65,000 Brazilians. He also released a video of him taking hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malarial drug with unproven effectiveness against COVID-19. Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports.
Telling reporters to stand back, President Bolsonaro announced he's tested positive to COVID-19.
You can see from my face that I'm well and I'm calm. Thanks to God, I'm fine.
This is the man who described the virus as like a little flu. He's no fan of the mask and has repeatedly told Brazilians not to worry.
Life goes on. Brazil has to produce. We have to get the economy going.
The president made light of his infection, crediting the controversial anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine for his mild symptoms, even though it's not proven effective against COVID-19.
He's going to say hydroxychloroquine cured him. It's something that I don't believe, but I hope he's well.
It's like a flu. We are always exposed.
1.6 million Brazilians have now been infected with coronavirus, yet the Brazilian president continues to downplay the severity of the pandemic. But there's no ignoring the 65,000 dead and increasing every day. After Boris Johnson's near-death experience, the Brazilian president's dose seems minor, but both emphasise that position and privilege offer no protection.
The virus doesn't really know who we are, whether we're prince or pauper. We're equally vulnerable.
That vulnerability may run more deeply than we thought. The World Health Organization is now acknowledging there is evidence emerging that infected droplets may travel further and linger longer than previously thought. Philip Williams, ABC News, Washington.
Winter Olympian Alex Pullin has died at Palm Beach on the Gold Coast in a spearfishing accident. The 32-year-old Australian snowboarder was found by a snorkeler on an artificial reef just before 11 o'clock this morning. Pullin was a two-time world champion in snowboard cross and competed for Australia in the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. Investigations into his death are continuing.
Surf lifeguards at scene were attending to a 32-year-old male who was found submerged on the reef, was brought in by surf lifeguards, council lifeguards. Advanced care paramedics, critical care paramedics and paramedics from the high acuity response unit attended the scene, but unfortunately after a long attempt of resuscitation the patient was unable to be revived. So it appears that the patient is potentially a drowning, but unfortunately we're not aware of any other conditions that the patient may have had, so we're not sure at this point in time. We'd only be speculating if there was any other thing that all we're aware of is that the patient was found at the bottom of the reef, was brought to the top by another snorkeler. It was brought in by lifeguards and resuscitation attempts were made here at the beach.
You're watching ABC News. You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. These are the top stories this hour. Victoria has recorded 134 new cases of coronavirus. Greater Melbourne and Mitchellshire are going back into lockdown from midnight tonight. Police and defence personnel will be checking people trying to leave the affected region. The state government is confident testing will be completed today in 9 high-rise public housing towers placed under home detention orders. A leaked email has revealed New South Wales Health failed to screen travellers arriving at Sydney Airport on a flight from Melbourne last night in a breach of coronavirus protocols. Last week, Health Minister Brad Hazzard said all passengers arriving from Victoria must undergo screening to ensure none are from the hotspots. Jetstar says procedures have since been reviewed. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the government is considering further restrictions which could isolate residents along its southern border from the rest of the state. Ms Berejiklian has asked residents in those communities not to travel, warning there's an extremely high chance COVID-19 will spread and formal restrictions will have to be imposed. A man has been arrested after allegedly attempting to cross the border at Corowa this morning without a permit. And as we've just been hearing, Australian Winter Olympian Alex Pullin has drowned in a spearfishing accident on the Gold Coast. The 32-year-old snowboarding champion was pulled unconscious from the water at Palm Beach this morning. Lifeguards and paramedics performed CPR, but he could not be revived. Federal Cabinet is meeting this afternoon to consider Australia's response to China's grab for stronger legal controls over Hong Kong. Scott Morrison's flagged a migration scheme is likely to be offered to Hong Kongers wanting to flee the territory now that Beijing has imposed new national security laws. Liberal backbencher Kevin Andrews is a co-convener of a parliamentary friendship group on Hong Kong. He's been speaking to National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
Kevin Andrews, we know the Federal Cabinet is meeting today to consider, amongst other things, some sort of migration policy when it comes to Hong Kongers. What are you looking for in any package they put together here?
I think two things are important, Greg. Firstly, we must continue to show our continuing solidarity for the people of Hong Kong. That's important for their morale, to know that the rest of the world is concerned about freedom and liberty in Hong Kong and it being trampled by the communist regime. But secondly, we should do something practical, and we should join with efforts with other like-minded countries who are also considering a range of visa and immigration options. What I think we should do is to provide a visa for young Hong Kong people. The British government has announced that holders of the British nationals' overseas passport will be able to return to the UK. That's immediately up to about 300,000 people and potentially millions of people. But the missing group is the young people, and they're the ones that have been at the forefront of these protests in Hong Kong. We can provide visas for students to come to Australian universities, which after all are looking for overseas students at the present time. time, and that could give them ultimately a way to get permanent residency of Australia.
OK, so in what sort of numbers and with what urgency? Because travel is obviously a bit of an issue, at least temporarily. But first of all, numbers, what do you think would be appropriate?
Look, we could change our points system so that we bring in more young people. We could have a special visa class for young people. You know, I think we could easily bring 200,000 young Hong Kongers to Australia, and that would actually help in terms of their plight at the present time. In terms of travel, that's of course going to be guided by the restrictions that apply from time to time. But I think just sending this message and saying, listen, we're prepared to do our bit to stand up for people standing up for themselves for freedom and democracy and liberty in Hong Kong. As I said, join with like-minded countries around the world, and together we could provide some sort of solution.
What's the alternative here? I mean, what sort of lives do you think they would lead, these former protesters or even current protesters, in Hong Kong in view of the national security law changes that Beijing has foisted upon the territory?
Well, these changes are quite draconian. I was speaking just yesterday to a group of young Hong Kong students who got out of Hong Kong. They tell me about the protests, about the increasing brutality from the police force towards them. And then you have these laws that have been put in place, which basically say somebody, for example, who's just protesting can be charged with serious criminal offences and jailed for years and years and years. Now, this is totally inappropriate, but that's what the communist regime is foisting upon Hong Kong, quite contrary to the agreement that had signed with Britain about one country and two systems. So we have some sort of responsibility to react, and remembering that these laws could apply to the 100,000 Australians who are actually resident in Hong Kong at the present time.
Well, yes, and then there's an associated question about Hong Kongers who are on temporary visas in Australia, whether they would be within the reach of the Chinese government for extradition purposes. Now, there is a debate running in Canada. Well, action has been taken in Canada and consideration is being given to extradition from Australia. What's your view on that?
I think we should seriously and immediately revisit the question of extradition from Hong Kong. We stood up against having an extradition arrangement with China. If mainland China has now taken over Hong Kong effectively, as this new law does, well then I think we should be looking again at whether or not it's appropriate to have an extradition arrangement with Hong Kong.
Is that, sorry to interrupt, to review it or to abolish it, rip it up?
Look, I think the first thing we should do is review it. That's obviously a sensible thing to do. But if we can't be guaranteed that it's not going to be used in a way which would end up taking people back to Hong Kong for what would be anywhere else a minor offence at the best, and then potentially jailing those people for years, well then that's not the sort of arrangement that we in a freedom-loving country like Australia would want, and the Australian people would expect us to have to be a party to. So ultimately, if that means ripping it up, then so be it.
OK. Now, just back on visa categories, you've proposed one predominantly for younger people in Hong Kong. What is your attitude towards, I think it's a substantial number of Hong Kongers in Australia on temporary visas at present? Should they perhaps be first cabs off the rank?
Well, certainly those visas should be renewed and extended. At the present time, they probably can't get back to Hong Kong anyway. If these are the sorts of people that we would otherwise want as migrants to Australia, and all the survey evidence indicates that people that have come from Hong Kong to Australia are working hard, they have good education, they have high schools, and they do contribute to our society. They're the sort of migrants we want in Australia, so let's look at extending those visas now, and then, if possible, to be able to offer them permanent residency.
We've already seen in Melbourne last year and in Sydney and also in Brisbane on university campuses in particular conflict between Chinese Australians who still maintain a loyalty to their home country and between former Hong Kongers protesting or making their point known in Australia. The sort of visa programs that you're talking about, can you be confident that this wouldn't exacerbate such arguments on the streets here in Australia?
Look, we don't want protests like that between groups on the streets in Australia. We should be a peaceful country and we should do everything to encourage people to be peaceful. But you've got to remember that some of these activities have been at the urging and indeed the direct encouragement of organisations such as the United Front, which is a front for the communist regime in various guises here in Australia. So we have to be sensible about it, but I don't think it's the Hong Kong students who are causing the problem.
All right. And just on another matter, related, I suppose, it's the travel advice that Australia has upgraded for Australians in China, warning of the possibility of arbitrary detention. Obviously, that would be alarming to you. Do you know anything of the threat assessments that sit behind that upgraded travel advice?
Well, even what we know from what's on the public record about Australians, for example, being arrested, quite clearly indicates that there is an arbitrary approach taken by the Chinese regime, and if they see it is in their interest to somehow put pressure on countries like Australia or Canada or the United States or United Kingdom, then there's a history of doing so. So Australians thinking of travelling to China should be very wary of the situation which has developed there.
All right, and just finally, because you are in Melbourne and representing the seat of Menzies, lockdown is coming back in where you live. What are you noticing about the immediate effects, particularly, I suppose, among business community in your part of Melbourne?
Well, people are feeling very vulnerable generally and quite frustrated about what's going on. They don't think there's been sufficient transparency from the Victorian government. They think they've been incompetent in terms of the way in which they've handled things like quarantine, and that they've been uneven in the way in which they've applied various restrictions. So people are very uneasy about this. Businesses are struggling. There are many retail businesses, for example, that are not reopening. There will be businesses going to the wall. There is, so many people unemployed, and this is going to get worse. And that's why Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg and the federal government has been trying to say we've got to get Australia back to work as soon as we can. That's a critical priority for us. But unfortunately here in Victoria, or at least in metropolitan Melbourne, that's going to be held up for a further period of weeks, if not months.
It certainly is. And the income supports is also a matter that Cabinet will be considering again today. Kevin Andrews, we are out of time. Thank you for your thoughts on Hong Kong and on matters relating to local lockdowns as well.
My pleasure.
Greg Dennett there speaking to the Liberal MP Kevin Andrews. Well, the smartphone app TikTok is under scrutiny in Australia for its ties to China, with some of the country's top cyber and national security minds warning the app could potentially be used by authorities in Beijing to monitor millions of Australian users. Paul Haskell-Dowland is Associate Dean for Computing and Security in the School of Science at Edith Cowan University. He joins me now live. Very good afternoon to you. First of all, perhaps we should explain for those that don't know, what is TikTok?
So, not wanting to try and pretend to be too hip and trendy, the TikTok app is fundamentally a social media app or a social media website, and it is predominantly used for sharing short-form video, so very small, isolated clips of video, and probably best known for the dance crazes. So people replicating dances or voicing over to songs in very short video forms.
So, Paul, the question here is whether data being gathered in the TikTok app could potentially be going to China. What are to the communist government in China? What are the risks?
So we've got to be very careful. At this stage, we don't know that this data is actually making its way to the Communist Party. But as with all Chinese-run organisations or companies, there is that risk that the data could be accessed by the government there. So being a Chinese company, so the company is actually based out of Beijing, there is that potential that Chinese authorities could insist on data being made available. And for most people, that may not be too much of an issue because your dance videos and the details of your user account may not be seen as particularly sensitive or something that you want to restrict access to, but it's the consequential damage that could come off of this. And obviously there's a national security concern in terms of the volume of data being sucked up by this and many other social media websites.
Well, I was going to say they're not unique, are they, TikTok, in gathering this sort of data? What information are they taking? What is of interest to TikTok as a company?
So the key information starts with the user identifiable information. So that is your name, your email address, you might be capturing your phone number as part of that, and your geographical location. So again, the problem that first of all springs to mind from a cyber perspective is that most users will reuse the same account details. So the account that you register with as you're sitting playing around with TikTok is possibly going to be using the same email address or username as we have on other systems. And for some users, it will be the same password. So straight away, there's a possibility of data being leaked and being reused on other websites. But when we then look at the mobile app implementation, we're also capturing a lot of additional information. So details of your device, details of perhaps your cellular connection, and again, geographical information that could be linked to that. And there's a particularly interesting part of the TikTok privacy policy, which again, most users will never read, which actually explicitly says that they will collate data across multiple devices and be able to combine it. So it's flagging to the user in a way that I've not seen in many other privacy policies, that there is a possibility that your activities on your mobile phone could then be linked to your activities on your laptop or your desktop device. And we've sort of seen this already, and many users will be familiar with the idea that if you're searching for something on one device, you suddenly start to see adverts, perhaps in Facebook, appearing on a different device. And it's that capability that is becoming quite prominent in some of these social media apps.
Yes, very interesting. I think I'm right in saying that, obviously TikTok deny that they give their data, their information to the Chinese government. But isn't it the case with Australian users of TikTok, that information, that data is actually stored in Singapore by TikTok?
So there's been a number of statements from TikTok, and it's worth noting they do have an Australian office, but they have confirmed in various posts recently that Australian user data is stored in Singapore. And in fact, they've made clear that the TikTok data itself is not stored in China, in Beijing. And so if you read on the surface, that would imply that there's no way for the government to gain access to the data. But if you look at the case in America, where the US government was effectively able to demand access to Facebook data despite being held in servers in Europe. So they were able to apply their legislation well beyond their borders. So it is quite possible that at some point in the future, a demand could be made by the Chinese government that TikTok, as a Chinese-based organization, could be compelled to respond to, and potentially then have to disclose data that at the moment they would argue that they are not in a position to have to do.
OK, so the discussion here is around, and I'm sure it's being had by governments right around the world. In fact, hasn't India already announced that a nationwide ban on TikTok? I mean, how realistic and is that? Can it be done logistically?
So it certainly can be done. From a technical perspective, you can block an application. So TikTok particularly is used by mobile users. And so the starting point would be the federal government to require the app to be withdrawn from the App Store. So that would stop any new users from installing the application. And it would also effectively prevent existing users from receiving updates. So eventually the app may well stop working. But the federal government can't mandate that users uninstall the app from their devices. So it wouldn't change the fact that it's already out there. The other approach that could be taken, which is applied in a similar way in terms of inappropriate or illegal content, they can work with the ISPs to block access. So they could effectively require the main ISPs in Australia to block access to the servers and the infrastructure of the TikTok empire. Again, that, whilst it would work in effect for some users, could also be circumvented. And we've already seen that with the geographical restrictions with iTunes, for example, or any other media service that blocks access or limits it in certain countries. We simply see users moving to VPNs and proxies, which allow you to bypass or evade those particular controls. So it will never be fully effective.
OK, and you'd have a lot of very fed-up tweens, teenagers, 20-somethings, wouldn't you? Paul Haskell-Dowland.
The future electorate.
Yes, quite. Paul Haskell-Dowland, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Catching up on the finance news now, here's Sue Lannin. Sue, afternoon to you again. Now, banks are extending the amount of time that people don't have to pay back loans for, aren't they?
Yeah, this is right. It's a big thing because a lot of people will not be able to start repaying their loans in September when this first moratorium ends. It was granted in March by the banking industry in consultation with the federal government. So the Australian Banking Association says the 6-month loan repayment holiday will be extended by 4 months. However, it has warned that some people will need extra support beyond them, but it is warning the 4-month extension will only be offered to customers who genuinely need more time, and banks will be looking at who can viably repay their loans. The business has spoken to National Australia Bank's head of personal banking, Rachel Slade. She says around 80% of customers may need to have the repayments extended. About 1 in 5 are expected to start making repayments.
We've just started checking in with our customers as they're sort of halfway through their deferral process. So we're still on a reasonably low base, but we have checked in with thousands of customers. We're building from this week, we'll speak to about 10,000 a week. And from those that we've checked in with, about 1 in 5 have opted to start making repayments again. But obviously we know that there's many of our customers who are doing it tough. There's lots of uncertainty and they're going to need our support for longer.
So the coronavirus is obviously having a massive impact on the world of business. The businesses in Victoria, Melbourne in particular, going back into lockdown. What's the immediate effect you're seeing so far?
Yes, well, Premier Investments, they own chains like Smiggle and Just Jeans and JJ's. They say that they're going to shut down their stores again in the Melbourne metropolitan area from midnight tonight. That's when the Victorian lockdown comes back into place. That this will affect stores across 36 shopping centres and 7 strip malls, but regional Victorian stores will stay open. Now, Premier says all eligible staff members will be stood down and they'll receive JobKeeper. It also says it won't be paying rent in those shopping centres where their stores are closed down, Lorna.
OK, it has had an effect as well on stocks, on businesses there. What is happening in Melbourne in terms of the stocks?
Yes, a big fall on the Australian share market today, deepened in the afternoon, particularly after the Prime Minister Scott Morrison came out and mentioned that there could be a slowdown in the rate of people returning to Australia by air. So the Australian share market really sold off today. The All Ordinaries deepened its losses ahead of Victoria's lockdown at midnight tonight. The ASX 200 off 1.5%, both major indexes off 1.5%. On the ASX 200, 168 stocks fell. The losers led by industrials, health stocks, consumer staples, banks, tech, oil stocks and miners. And the only areas going up were consumer discretionary stocks, telcos and gold miners because of a rise in gold prices. Let's have a look at some of those movers. So we saw a big rally in tech, but then they fell back and Afterpay led the falls. It's returned to trade from a discounted share sale where it raised $650 million. As I mentioned, gold miners at one bright spot. Northern Star had a trading update. It will pay a fully franked dividend to investors, so its shares jumped. ANZ was the worst of the big banks because of that loan repayment holiday, fell more than 2%. Domain fell nearly 10%. WiseTech had a big sell-off today, down 2.6%, despite some accounting changes which will improve its bottom line. I think that's what investors are worried about. And the buy now, pay later firm Splitters saw a record June quarter. That's on a huge rise in sales and revenue because of the coronavirus. Looking at Asian markets, the Nikkei fell in Japan, but a big rally in Hong Kong and China. The Shanghai market up 61 points. That as the Chinese government or Chinese commentators talk up a so-called bull market. And let's have a look at the Australian dollar, another casualty of the worsening economic outlook in Australia because of the rise in coronavirus cases in Victoria. The Aussie dollar buying 64.4 US cents and it's lower against other major currencies. That's all from me. Elise Morgan up tonight on The Business. She will be talking further to executives from National Australia Bank and ANZ about the extension of this loan repayment holiday. And that's finance.
So thanks very much for that. A new study by Murdoch Children's Research Institute has found that toddlers who were obese and overweight showed signs of cardiovascular disease when they were 11 years old. Until now, little has been known about when and how early body weight impacted heart health as kids grew up. Dr. Kate Lysett says it is concerning that prevalence rates haven't changed in the past decade.
So we were able to follow up over 1,800 children across the country, and they were weighed and measured every 2 years. And then at age 11 to 12, they had a thorough heart health assessment. And what we found is that children who were overweight and obese early in life had stiffer arteries, they had thicker arterial lining of the arteries, and they were also at much higher risk of later developing metabolic syndrome. It really shows us the silent effects of obesity that happen early in life, and children who were overweight and obese for longer had a much higher risk of having poor heart health. So it also shows us that that cumulative effect is quite big. We know from our colleagues in Finland that if children are able to resolve to a normal weight by early adulthood, they actually have the same cardiometabolic risk as their peers who were normal weight children throughout their lives. So we know that if we can turn this around, we're likely to be able to hopefully prevent cardiovascular disease later in life, which is the #1 killer in Australia. So this is really important, but we really need to make inroads to curbing the obesity epidemic because the prevalence rates haven't changed for the last decade. We know that families it's really challenging, and that's why we're calling for much stronger preventative and public health efforts at the societal level to try and to tackle this issue. I think it's very clear that what we're doing isn't working, so we need to try something new, and that could involve things like restriction on junk food advertising to children, increasing taxes on sugar and sweetened beverages and high energy dense food. And also, things like making sporting activities much more affordable for families. So there's a lot that we could do, but it's very clear that we need to tackle this from a number of different angles, and one thing isn't going to solve the issue.
Dr. Kate Lysett talking about childhood obesity. That is the afternoon news here on the ABC News channel. Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView as well. Stay with us. I'll bring you more on all of our top stories. Those are 147 new cases of coronavirus around Australia today. 134 of those from Victoria, most from those hotspots in Melbourne. We'll bring you live reports from there. 3 new cases in the ACT as well this afternoon. So we'll bring you a roundup from the country. We'll also be getting an update on all the sport this afternoon, the impact the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the sport, and Anna Henderson will be bringing us a report from the Bushfire Royal Commission. That and the weather forecast coming up in the next hour here on ABC News. Do stay with us.